Are you one of the many poor people that have nowhere to go after the collapse of Rome? Well, here's a tip. Just stop being poor by just going to Venice. Travel to Venice, the most flourished city in all of Europe. Before you move to Venice, it is beneficial to have a good understanding of who comprises the population. Regarding ethnicities, Venice is predominantly the remaining Romans after the fall of the Great Empire. However, some notable groups that create a substantial minority are Italians, Jews, and some Middle Eastern folk. In short, Venice's population is mostly white Caucasians, with some Eastern influence. Language in Venice also remains consistent. The predominant language is Latin, but later in the post-classical period, a variant of Latin becomes more common. Informally called Vulgar Latin, Italian becomes a more influential language after the post-classical period. The Latin language is commonly used in daily activities such as literature and other important trade. One thing worth noting is the exceptionally balanced gender equality in Venice. Disregarding the patriarchy of the Eastern world, Venice had the most propitious opportunities for both genders. In Venice, not only could women manage shops and other businesses without the supervision of men, it neither included the societal tensions that women were inferior. Venice has historically always been referred to as female, and embodied many of the positive characteristics that Venice possessed, such as being powerful and creative, intelligent and graceful. Social classes were also dictated by the wealth of a citizen. More affluent citizens had more political power and influence over the economy. This most resembles the Roman society with the class structure of patricians and plebeians. Lastly, the population of Venice was mostly Catholic. Although initially Christian, most Venetians are heavily religious, and nuns and priests heavily advocated religion. The government also implied that they were religious. Most cathedrals and churches were ordered by the government. They followed most of the conventions of Roman Catholicism, but slightly deviated by allowing subjects to dedicate church altars to just saints instead of only God. However, if you had different beliefs or weren't Caucasian, there was no prejudice against you. The government offered ethnic and religious tolerance to all citizens. At its peak during the 17th century, the population of Venice peaked at 170,000, but some sources claim it to be as high as 180,000. Venice in many ways was equally cultured and educated as it was wealthy. Financed by a seemingly endless Venetian economy, Italian Renaissance-level art, literature, and architecture came early to the Venetians, thanks to its incredible monetary vault. Venetian art was mostly influenced by Greek art and like-minded Italian Renaissance artists. Dominant genres were Romanticism, still lifes, icons, and realism. Characteristics of Venetians' art were free brushwork, lighting effects, rough weave on canvas, colorism, and heavy use of color theory and color effects. Oily paint and complicated layers and painting, rich shading, models, and structures. Notable artists are Titan, Giovanni Bellini, Antonio Vivaldi, and Tintoretto. Architecture comprised a noticeable portion of Venetian culture. The geography of Venice required for canals and bridges to connect the entirety of the islands. Many of the structures were comprised of marble, and some recognizable influences and styles that Venice incorporated were Byzantine, Gothic, Renaissance, Roman, classic architecture, and some Islamic influences in churches. The small area also contributed to the architecture of Venice. There was an emphasis on vertical construction, so architects had to carefully yet creatively build their structures. Religious architecture can also be commonly seen with the abundance of religious structures, statues, and imageries. Some of these structures were even painted on. Lastly, literature. The Venetians were great scribes, but that doesn't mean they didn't know how to write anything on their own. Poetry was the most common form of literature in Venice, and a genre that was frequently seen was Romanticism poetry. Goldoni and George Sand were quite the wordsmiths, and cemented the fact that Venetians had something of a renaissance themselves. Education and developing skills were important to Venetians. Some schools that Venice had were Santovino, San Michele, and most famously Palladio. The first significant factor that contributed to Venetian success was geography. Venice was a small city near the Mediterranean. It had favorable qualities such as plentiful sea routes and fertile soil. They traded along the Adriatic and Mediterranean Sea, and even along Eastern Africa and the Indian Ocean. They frequently traded with the Byzantine, Ottomans, Germany, Spain, Egypt, and Syria. The goods that they typically traded were spices, pepper, grain, Italian wood, slaves from Dalmatia, woolen products, alum, sugar, lacquer, and raw silk from Asia. However, they are most known for their manufactured and luxury goods. The first product to consider is textiles. Venetian merchants were highly awarded for having the best textiles for carpentry, rope, fabric, and sails. Similarly, refined goods such as silk, velvet, and satin were equally praised. They include both creative and oriental influenced designs and patterns on their fabric, Multicolored velvet with gold and silver linings were used by Venetian elites for decorations. In addition to their elegant wood carvings, perhaps their greatest contribution to the world is their work on glassware and decorative glass. Since the 10th century, they were pioneers in glass blowing and made luxurious goblets, pitchers, dishes, bottles, and vases, mirrors, candelabras, and jewelry. In the 13th century, they produced high-quality timekeeping devices, also known as hourglasses for sailors. And in the 14th century, they made spectacles. This greatly increased the productivity of visually impaired citizens. Angelo Barovier was an important glass blower for his contribution to variety and design. They were equally skilled goldsmiths, which proved their dominance in metallurgy. Many Venetian artisans were paid by churches as iconographers and mosaicists, and later in the 9th and 10th centuries as scribes and calligraphers. The government was also very wise with their economy. For example, they had one of the very first banks in Europe and had a government-controlled bond market in the 14th century. Trade in Venice was most expediently carried out through their intricately designed ships. Venice was internationally acclaimed for their constructions of ships and was a considerable part of their economy. Venice had two types of ships, cogs, general-purpose trade ships, but their more specialized ships were galleys. They were man-powered and preferred by the navy. To list out the distinction between galleys and cogs, cogs only carried typical cargo, such as spices and raw goods, used sails for navigation. However, it took up until the invention of the magnetic compass in 1270 to sail annually. Prior to this, they could not sail from October to April, or nearly half a year. Galleys, on the other hand, carried refined luxury goods such as velvet, silk, or even gold. They did not rely on silly winds to carry their cargo, they did it themselves. 25 rows of 3 people on each side powered the whole ship, and this made turning and navigating easier when there was no wind. They additionally had a group of approximately 25 crossbowmen to protect them from pirates or would-be assaulters. If they ever got tired, they just cycled through people, perpetuating the chattery. By the 11th century, Venice had a navy of approximately 3,000 ships that they later established as the Arsenal in 1104. Their naval dominance is why I believe that Venice was able to secure themselves as an economic stronghold despite its less than expansive territory. Galleys were owned by the government and were rented out to the highest bidder. Additionally, Venice built ships for the Crusades. And in 1592, Galileo Galilei, yes him, worked on Venetian ships to improve structure and speed. However, as with most good things, the galleys were eventually ended and overshadowed by the improvements of ship structure, firearms, and sails. These colossal sources of wealth and constant trade led to Venice becoming the second most populated city in Europe, following Paris, but the most wealthy city in the world by 1500. Venice was a republic, more specifically a maritime republic, which just is a term that covered many of the Mediterranean states during the time. Venice was governed by the Dojado, or the Doge. Unfortunately, when we look in the AP textbooks, we wouldn't find this in there. At least he has a funny hat. The Doge was an elected official that received checks and balances from extremely wealthy nobles, and 3 parties that approved his actions. These parties were the Ducal, Curia, and legislative assemblies. Venetian diplomacy was mainly very professional, pragmatic, and focused on commercial interests. The first Doge was Paolo Lucio Anafesto, who began his rule in 697. But before it was a sophisticated city-state, it was a place of sanctuary for the Romans. Roman refugees banded together near the shore of Italy when Lombards and the Huns attacked most of northern Europe. The population of fishermen and salt workers needed to defend themselves against hostile forces, and on March 25th, 421 AD, Venice was formed. In 641, political authority shifted to them because of the fall of Byzantine rule in that area, which Doge Orso declared an independence from in an anti-Byzantine military declaration in 725. 11th century Norman expansion threatened to cut communications in the south, so actions by Domenico Salvo and Vitale Flair ensured that Venice would have freedom to the Mediterranean. After Venice attacked the Normans, Byzantine Emperor Alexis I granted unrestricted trade through the entire Byzantine Empire in 1082 as a gesture of gratitude. War and failure of military operations caused economic and financial failure. Venetian War with Pula and Chioggia was from 1380 to 1381. Later, the Peace of Turin in 1381 eliminated Genoese political influence from the Mediterranean. Venice had to remain neutral with the Turkish Empire, but still overthrew lords of Italy to get rich lands and resources from that area. In 1453, Venice had to defend an eastern colony. It fell to the Turks anyway in 470, but loss of land and annual tribute of 10,000 gold had to be made each year. Did you get all that? Probably not, but regardless if you were paying attention to the politics, you can still recognize one thing. Venice was a paragon of prosperity for all merchants of all races and skilled laborers around the world. Due to the many numerous opportunities for citizens, cultural dominance, and tolerance for all divisions of man.